What is up, horror fans? This is Pete, and I'm kind of disappearing into this background over here. It looks a little weird, but I'm here with my good friend, Dr. Zayas God, and we're going to talk about a documentary that covers pretty much an iconic movie. You can tell by the background, the documentary is about RoboCop, and it's called RoboDoc. Now, Danny, RoboCop, I wouldn't classify it as a horror movie, right? But it seems like it's that kind of movie where horror fans really love it. And you'll see horror fans tweet about it and post about it, and they'll cosplay sometimes, or wear merch that has it. You have a RoboCop shirt, right?
I believe I have one buried in the collection. Like I jokingly said to some of my students yesterday, gaining weight made a lot of my shirts not compatible with me right now. So I have to lose a few more pounds so I could pull out all the good shirts. RoboCop came out in that era, though, of like real gritty, bloody sci-fi.
Yeah.
And I feel like there's an entire section of 80s sci-fi that is close enough to the horror genre that it merits us talking about it on this channel. The Terminator, of course, which this documentary goes into, the importance of Cameron's 1984 film, but just this movie on its own, taking away the blood and all the blood squibs that go off, this movie is very body horror. I mean, Alex Murphy's death scene is one of the most graphic and horrible death scenes you'll ever see. The villains in this movie are some of the worst, most evil people that you will ever meet.
Right.
And what happens to Murphy is effectively a body horror transformation. He's dead, and his body is put, twisted with metal. There's a lot of, Tetsuo the Iron Man in there, and
Right.
he's turned into a cyborg, and when you, this documentary, RoboDoc, the creation of RoboCop, it's streaming on SCREAMBOX. I'll get into SCREAMBOX more in a second, but it inspired me. I loved it so much, this first episode, hour and about 8 minutes, that I legit rewatched the RoboCop trilogy yesterday. I watched all three of the original movies. Granted, the original is an all-time classic, and parts 2 and 3 are there. But like, there's a scene in part 2. I don't know if you've seen part 2 lately or ever.
Not lately, no.
There's a scene in part 2 where the villains basically rip RoboCop apart and leave him in pieces.
Yeah.
And in the next scene, like, his upper torso is just hanging at the police station. And it's so creepy, with like the face of Peter Weller on this machine, and like just wires and plugs coming out of him as he's like torn asunder. And it is, this is 1987. Cronenberg's The Fly came out a couple years before this, and Hellraiser came out the same year, 1987. So this is not too different as a body horror film than some of those other, all-time classic horror films. Because he's a cyborg, because he's a machine, it falls more deeply into science fiction. And of course, it also is a pure action movie. But RoboCop is a movie that has endured, and I think it's gotten better as time goes on, because a lot of the themes that RoboCop talks about have permeated the zeitgeist, so to speak.
Yeah.
The whole anti-corporate feel, the anti-privatization. Sunday, I'm actually going to the movie theater. Fathom Events is putting They Live back into the movies.
Nice.
And RoboCop and They Live are actually very similar in their kind of takedown of Reagan and Reaganomics of the 80s.
Right.
And all of the, you know, a lot of like when you look at the inner city vibe of those two movies, the way they talk about the government, the way they talk about the economy, there it would be better for us today if they were just movies of their time, but unfortunately they have a lot of staying power.
Right.
And I think this documentary, episode 1, does a really good job of getting into that whole aspect of, you know, old Detroit. In fact, the title of the episode is Destination Delta City, which of course is, you know, the newer, more gentrified version of old Detroit that they're basically trying to tear down, not only in the original, but in the later sequels as well.
Yes, right. You know, and it's funny that you kind of talked about the sequels a little bit just now, because you asked me, have I seen RoboCop 2 lately, or have I ever seen it? I've seen RoboCop 1 and 2. I don't think I've ever seen 3, but it's been a very long time since I've seen RoboCop. And I remember watching it a lot as a kid, and I don't think I've seen it really, maybe even as a teenager or as an adult. But it's one of those movies that once you had like YouTube and podcasts, people just talk about it a lot, and they just do reviews of it, even though it's from 1987. You know, it's almost 40 years old. Recently, it's been on 2 of my favorite YouTube channels. It's been on Mr. Sunday Movies. This guy, The Weekly Planet, that's the name of his show. And they covered RoboCop 1, 2, and 3 on their show. And then Half in the Bag or Red Letter Media, they're one of our inspirations for like my channels that I do. And they covered RoboCop 2 on their show Review. So like people are always talking about it. And it's interesting that like you mentioned that this is on SCREAMBOX. You know, SCREAMBOX, a streaming channel that is primarily for like horror movies and like disturbing horror movies, and yet they have this 1987 dystopian science fiction action movie documentary on there. So I think it's real interesting. You know, this movie just is always there. People are always thinking about it. The image that we have behind us is this like iconic image that it's referenced in like album covers and just like artwork that always has that nostalgia feel. I think that when people have that nostalgia for the 80s, which there's like so much of it, you know, even in like In Search of Tomorrow, right? The documentary that we covered on the other channel, there's always these posters that have these montages of all these things. And you always have like Star Wars, maybe the Predator, you absolutely always have the Terminator, but always, always, always on these posters is RoboCop. And it's always like this image that's right behind us right now. I mean, I love it, and I haven't seen the movie in probably decades, but this documentary is so good that it makes you feel how relevant the movie is and how it's almost like lightning in a bottle that they had all these creative forces come together to make this fucking batshit crazy movie.
When you look at the and again, this just the first episode, just to give you a little talking about this documentary. This is the first of 4 parts that are going to be releasing each of the next Tuesdays. So the next episode comes out on September 5th, then it's September 12th and the 19th. It's a 4-part documentary series, RoboDoc, the Creation of RoboCop. And yeah, they get into like this all-time assortment of talent that they had. I mean, when you have Phil Tippett creating the monsters and the robots, and then you have Rob Bottin creating the actual RoboCop suit himself. This is the guy who did the special effects for The Thing. This is Phil Tippett, who would basically did Return of the Jedi, all the stop motion effects that you know and love, and worked on the dinosaurs in Jurassic Park. These are geniuses. These are the top people in their field. You know, these are not just like people. These are people that horror fans know the history of. And they're just 2 of the guys that worked on this.
Right. And you're such a big fan of Phil Tippett's movie, Mad God, too.
Look, I said I respected the movie. I didn't want to watch 90 minutes of shit men. It's not my fault.
Okay.
I do want to bring up something though. Like you made this point, and you're right. Why is this documentary about what is effectively a sci-fi action movie. Why is it on SCREAMBOX? So let me give you why I think it's on SCREAMBOX, and it has to do with who made this documentary. It's directed and written by Eastwood Allen, who does not have a lot of credits on IMDb, but his partner is Christopher Griffiths. Christopher Griffiths is part of a team of writers, directors, and producers who have made some of the coolest and best horror documentaries of the last decade. On SCREAMBOX right now, you can find Hollywood Dreams and Nightmares, the Robert Englund story, which they did. You can find all over streaming. You can find Pennywise, the story of It, which they did. We are both big fans of Fright Night. They did a documentary called You're So Cool, Brewster, the story of Fright Night. They've done documentaries about Hellraisers parts 2 and 3. I believe they worked on the Pet Sematary documentary, which came out years ago and is really good also. They are some of the best filmmakers when it comes to documentaries on specific horror films and franchises. So when you take that into account, and when you take into account that like Hollywood Dreams and Nightmares is SCREAMBOX has really come a long way in the last few years. I would say about 2 years ago, I would have said to you, Shudder is up here and SCREAMBOX is, they're okay, but they're way down here. As much as I love Shudder, and we both love Shudder, it has really narrowed. It has really leveled out over these last 2 years. And not even really, I'm not even saying that to put Shudder down. SCREAMBOX has just done a phenomenal job. They have partnered with filmmakers, production companies. They got Terrifier 2 before anybody else. They got The Barn 2 before anybody else, which is a movie we covered on this channel.
Yeah.
They're getting these documentaries like Hollywood Dreams and Nightmares, the Robert Englund story, and RoboDoc, which this was a crowdfunded documentary that has been sending out Blu-rays, and this has been in the works for a very long time. So for SCREAMBOX to get this exclusively, again, you know, SCREAMBOX is a pay service. It's $4.99 a month. If you do their 6-month or yearly subscriptions, it's actually less money a month. So you're probably, if you're a horror fan, better off to do that. I'm lucky enough to have gotten a year subscription for free because I won a horror trivia at the bar that I go to.
Nice.
But when that year is up, which it's got to be coming up soon, I think, I will gladly give them, you know, probably the yearly subscription rate because it's cheaper per month, because they're really doing a great job in the horror streaming space. And, you know, we talked at the beginning, RoboCop is the type of movie that, yes, it's sci-fi, yes, it's action, but this is a movie that appeals to a horror fan. There's body horror elements. There's so much blood and gore in this movie. In fact, the next episode, which comes out Tuesday the 5th, is the subtitle of that is Verhoeven's Mantra, which I'm pretty sure they said in this is more blood, right? Wasn't it just more blood? So, yeah. But Christopher Griffiths and his team, I know Gary Smart is one of the producers. I think John Campopiano is one of the producers. So that is a team that has been working on awesome horror documentaries for a long time. And I think that's part of the reason that this got to SCREAMBOX. But yeah, Christopher Griffiths and Eastwood Allen do a great job writing and directing at least this first episode. I mean, I'm so excited for the rest of this.
Yeah. And, you know, speaking of documentaries, our friend Chris made this comment once, and I think it was kind of like a little bit of a jab at us, and that's okay. But I think it was like, I don't know, I find it difficult to talk about talking heads. He said something like that, like about like talking about documentaries. And I think he has a good point, because essentially we're talking about something where people are just doing what we're doing right now. It's like, you know, when you look at a mirror in a mirror and it just keeps going, that's sort of what we're doing. You know, now there's going to be a YouTube video of people talking about our video, right? Talking about this documentary. But I think that there's something to be said about how well a documentary is made. And what's interesting about the documentaries that we love, right? In Search of Tomorrow, In Search of Darkness, this, I know you've covered a lot of other documentaries on this channel too, is that it is always treated like the people that make these movies are rock stars. And these are people that, like, Peter Weller is an established known actor, but he's not like established in the sense of like Tom Cruise or, you know, Brad Pitt or like these big name guys. He's been around forever, but I don't know if like you show a picture to him to a random person, they're gonna be like, that's Peter Weller. You know, they might
I
know it's
don't.
RoboCop. Go ahead.
Yeah. I don't even know if Peter Weller, I think Peter Weller's retired from acting because, so just to give you and our any listeners, I'm a history teacher. And when I teach my freshman history classes in high school, there's an amazing documentary series on the History Channel called Engineering an Empire, where they go thousands of years back and they give a detailed description of how this empire was built up. They've done, you know, the Mayans, the Aztecs, Rome, uh, the Byzantines, you name it. They have an episode on it. Peter Weller is on screen as the narrator, but he's there and he's talking about the history. And he apparently, you get the real sense just from listening to him for 5 seconds that this is a wild guy to talk to. He's so interesting. I genuinely would just love to sit with him and talk about history and like never bring up RoboCop. But he talked about, you know, he was a dancer. He was a musician. He was going to be a jazz musician. And then he got into acting. He's a true Renaissance man. And like later in his career, I think he went to Europe and he went to university in Europe and became like a history scholar. And now he does like History Channel talking head documentaries. And like you get him on this, you know, so yeah, there are people our age who know who Peter Weller is, who might have grown up with Buckaroo Banzai and RoboCop. But people younger than us probably don't know him from much unless they've seen movies from the early to mid 80s.
Right.
You know, Nancy Allen is, you know, she was a true starlet of the late 70s and early 80s. Obviously, I don't know if she's still married to Brian De Palma, but I think they were a couple, and she was in all of his movies from Carrie to Blowout. I think she's in, Dress to Kill, of course. And, you know, she was like, you know, I love her line in the documentary where she's like, I didn't have to wear
Black
like
lingerie.
black. Yeah, I didn't have to wear black lingerie. So I knew this was a movie I wanted to do. And,
Right.
you know, so this was like a real change of pace for her.
Yeah.
You had Ronnie Cox. Oh my God. Ronnie Cox, if you watched movies in the 70s, Ronnie Cox was always like the kind of crying in the corner best friend, whether it was Deliverance or was he in he might have been in the Deer Hunter, but he's always like they show him in Deliverance, like sitting off to the side crying.
Yeah.
And then we know him, Paul Verhoeven had him as Dick Jones in this. And then, of course, as Cohagen in Total Recall just a couple years later. And he is so awesome as the villain. And he looks like he aged like fine wine. Like this movie, like you said, is like 35 years ago. He looks like he might have aged 10 years.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
like he looks like he can do Dick Jones again if they rebooted this movie.
Yes, and they did reboot this movie, and it's
Oh God,
so
I forgot
lame.
they did reboot this movie.
It's so lame compared to this movie from 1987. And I just kind of want to keep talking about the behind the scenes thing because I mean that's what the whole fucking documentary is about. But you kind of just went into all the actors and how important they are and how great they are. The behind the scenes, the documentary itself starts out with the screenplay, and it starts out with Ed Neumeyer, and Michael Miner. And they really focus on Ed Neumeyer right away. They talk about where he got the inspiration. And it's interesting because, you know, we've covered a lot of documentaries on our channel, but 2 documentaries that I just love so much. There's one that's about the making of Blade Runner, and there's one that's about the making of Alien. And they're both like the behind the scenes that you come with like one of the DVDs, probably on multiple DVDs. But I love the Ridley Scott behind the scenes stuff. And it's interesting because Ed Neumeyer worked on the set of Blade Runner. I mean, I don't even think he had like an official job, but he was there as they were filming it. And, you know, he looked at Rachel, who plays Rachel again from
Sean Young.
Sean, thank you so much. Yeah, I see Sean Young, and the guy's like, that's the robot in the movie. And Ed Meyer's like, that's not the robot. That's not what robots look like. And then he said that he saw the spinner, you know, the cop car from Blade Runner, and that was what inspired the path that he took to get to RoboCop. And I love it because Ed Meyer, you know, he seems a lot like me, or his interest and mine seem to line up pretty much a lot. You know, he talked about 2000 AD, which is the comic that has Judge Dredd. I'm a big 2000 AD fan. There's artwork that like he would reference to create the characters in the movie, and he'd show them to the other filmmakers. And like the artwork is like stuff that I've seen from sci-fi magazines. He was like inspired by anime or manga for Ed 209. And it's just so cool seeing the images and the things that he liked to read. He talked about like he liked to read Philip K. Dick and how that inspired the screenplay. Yeah. You know, I mentioned just a minute ago the Alien documentary and the behind the scenes there. They go into wow, dude, this is the problem with recording so early. I just forget everybody's fucking names. But like the guy that wrote Alien, he did
Dan O'Bannon.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dan O'Bannon. When they interview Dan O'Bannon in that documentary, he's this quirky, interesting, weird dude too, and he talks about all of his influences as well. And it's just like there's something about that fucking 80s time period, that late 70s, early 80s time period, where you have these guys that just have these ideas, and their ideas are so like different and weird and quirky, but it's because of like what they grew up watching and liking, and then like what they were into like when they were in college and stuff. And it just makes these fucking iconic movies like Alien and RoboCop.
Yeah.
You know,
we covered that Alien documentary, and I believe that was Alexander O'Philippe. And he's if you're watching a documentary about the movie industry or horror, it's either probably Christopher Griffiths and his crew, or it's Alexander O'Philippe. He did the Alien one. He did I believe it's called Doc of the Dead on Romero and the Dead movies.
Yeah.
And he did the interview with Leap of Faith with William Friedkin.
So good.
Which
so
we
good.
talked about last month.
Yes.
One thing about Ed Meyer, they showed the photos of him in the early 80s on set, and he looks like a dead ringer. His hair was longer, and he's wearing like kind of a plaid flannel shirt, and he is a dead ringer for Roddy Piper in They Live. And I was like, holy shit, he looks just like Nada in They Live. Okay.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed him and Mike Miner's conversations. I love that kind of behind the scenes stuff where, you know, yes, they bring up Blade Runner, of course. I love, you know, like you said, how he wants it to be an actual robot. And then the Terminator comes out, and there's part of them. And to be fair to these guys, they had this idea years before the Terminator came out. And really, there are no similarities between the Terminator and RoboCop. It's just large cyborg-style machines in the movie. That's the only similarity, and the immense amount of violence. But there was like, you know, the studio, half of them are like, oh God, the Terminator, that's it, we're done. The giant robot's been done. And then when the Terminator made so much money, everybody went, oh, wait a minute. People like giant robots. Let's do this movie. And like how, you know, there's that idea that, oh God, this movie is too similar to us, we have to shut down, versus, oh, that movie's making money, let's piggyback off of them. And really the Terminator's success pushed this really into motion. You get a lot from John Davison, who is one of the executive producers of RoboCop, and he just seemed like such a fun guy to be around. He actually ends up doing the voice of Ed 209, which they have the recordings of, which are so much fun to listen to.
Yes.
There's so much cool stuff in here. My favorite stories were there's two things that to me stood out where the Paul Verhoeven,
Yeah.
the whole acquisition of Verhoeven as the director, and
Yes.
basically him wanting to do a Blade Runner, and them
Right.
basically saying, well, here's the thing.
Yeah.
You can have the Blade Runner background,
Yeah.
or you can have RoboCop. And he was like, well, I'll take RoboCop then.
Right.
And
Right.
that's kind
Right.
of why the background of OCP and old Detroit is like, these rundown cities. They said they filmed in Dallas and they found these really great buildings in Dallas to use.
Yeah.
So, yeah, another Texas movie.
Yeah. Yeah. That kind of blew my
And
mind, the behind the scenes there. Yeah. And you know what, Danny,
yeah,
I know you said you had two things. Why don't you talk about the second thing? Here's the thing. I left my charger in the other room and my
go
computer's
for
about
it.
to die. So
Oh, that's not good.
I'm going to get that. You say your second point. I'll be
Yeah.
right back. Okay.
The other thing I loved about Verhoeven was the Jesus referencing. I loved him, basically saying he wanted this to be a Jesus story. For those people who watch the Honest Trailer, Screen Junkie YouTube channel, they do the Honest Trailers every week on Tuesday. And the Honest Trailer for RoboCop has one of the greatest lines in it that has always stuck with me. And it's, this movie is a Jesus story, except this Jesus shoots criminals in the dick. And I love that Verhoeven just comes out and goes, yeah, I wanted this to be a Jesus metaphor. He dies, he comes back to life. But the second thing was when Peter Weller is talking about how he was going to get the movements down for RoboCop and how they brought in this motion coach, this movement person named Moni Yakim to basically train Peter Weller in these like evocative movements, and how he learned how to be RoboCop by working with this almost like dance coordinator who would tell him like move with your chest and turn your head first and the body will follow. And when you watch RoboCop and you watch Peter Weller's movements, especially when you first meet RoboCop, the way that his head is so like, and then the body twists and follows. I was talking about Moni Yakim, the
Yes.
the motion coach or the dance coach that Peter Weller worked with. I thought that whole dynamic was absolutely fascinating. How, it's something we don't think about with actors and learning how to act. It's, oh, here's the script, learn these lines, put emotion
Yeah.
into them. And then for
No,
Peter Weller, it's basically you have to take all the emotion out of your voice, but your performance is going to be all physical, all based on your movements. And he like goes through this complex training regimen
yeah.
with this motion coordinator, which I found awesome.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's the cool thing about documentaries, right? Is that when you think about a documentary, you think it's like, okay, it's behind the scenes. They're essentially just relating facts to us. They're telling us how something happened. But a good documentary can be just as exciting as a fictional film, right? And that sequence where they talk about getting the suit for Peter Weller and how the suit didn't fit, they shut down production and it seemed like they weren't going to make the movie. That's this great dramatic part in this first episode, and it's really it made me like happy just when they talked about how the movement coordinator came in and he's like, okay, remove these pieces of the costume and then this is how you're going to move now. And it's amazing because it's like you literally see like what the RoboCop character is. You literally like see it get born in a story. They explain like, well, I mean, because that's essentially there's the amazing look of RoboCop, which they go into detail in this documentary about too. But then there's Peter Weller's movement and his performance, right? Like that is like so much of the essence of the character. And then did you mention the suit and the look when I was standing up?
No, but we can get into that now. Sure.
Yeah, I got a little worried because I'm wearing my pajamas and I'm hoping that I didn't expose my robo dick on camera when I was looking. Luckily, it all kinds of blends in with this virtual background. But anyway, going over the actual suit itself, it's really interesting because they show this bust of Judge Dredd, and they're like, "Oh, Judge Dredd was never really an inspiration for RoboCop, but when I see it, it's like, oh, I can tell it is." And like the bus they show looks just like Judge Dredd, you know. And then they have this guy Rob Bottin, who's just this fucking legend already, making the suit, and they're talking about like Paul Verhoeven's frustration with the suit, and they were saying that like when they were forming it, people would come by and like make dicks out of the clay and put it on the suit. You know, I mean, we're talking about dicks a lot for some reason this morning, but with the suit, it's interesting because it's so important. It's like it's this iconic image, and you see like the frustration they had and how difficult it was to make it work in real life, and then they find this imagery that is like from a comic, and they're like, okay, we're gonna make it nice and sleek and sexy. And I think that like RoboCop is probably one of the most iconic images from the 80s, you know, and I think it's just based on that design.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they basically said they took the robot from Metropolis and then added like sexy manga art to it,
right,
to create the final image of RoboCop, which I love. That's amazing. And I there's so many, you know, it's just so worth watching because there's so many little tidbits that all the cast and all the crew have about like you brought up that like they basically almost shut down the set because the actors and Verhoeven couldn't figure stuff out and couldn't get along, and they like they were like, all right, let's just shut down for a day and calm everybody down. And like Peter Weller and Paul Verhoeven like admitted that like they both like went up to each other and apologized and shook hands again. I'm like, it's crazy that, you know, how close they are to we were to like having this iconic movie fall apart. And you know, and just so much of everything about this movie is so iconic, and I'm actually really happy that they broke it up into episodes. Like we cover the In Search of Darkness documentaries. We are down for 4 to 5 hours of straight documentary, but at the same time, like I spent the first 45 minutes going, oh man, where's Kurtwood Smith? Where's Ray Wise? Like, where's the Wrecking Crew? And they literally bring them in and then go to credits. And I'm like, oh, they're going to start the next movie. The one thing I think we need to talk about, because it was one of the funniest things in this first episode, is the poor guy who had to get all the squibs exploded on him.
Absolutely.
The guy, Kenny, who dies right at the beginning of the movie in the boardroom. When Ed 209 malfunctions, is one of the, like, that is a scene in the movie that lets you know everything about what this movie is really about. The fact that nobody in the movie reacts to the fact that this guy was just brutally, disgustingly murdered. Everybody, it's a boardroom, and everybody's like, oh, this is going to hurt the company. And I think Peter Weller even said his favorite line of dialogue in the entire movie is Dan O'Hurley, who we know from Halloween 2 as Connell Cochran. He's the old man, like the head of OCP. And his reaction to this guy being blown up with like the most squibs ever used on one person in a movie is, oh, Dick, this is such a disappointment.
Right.
He actually comes back. He actually comes back for part 2 and has this absolutely amazing moment at the end of part 2 where he's walking out of OCP after RoboCop's just defeated the new RoboCop 2, and there's a dead body on the floor, and he just steps over the dead body to get into his limo. It's just an amazing little moment. But the actor, and I don't remember who the actor was, who plays Kenny, who gets, I think they said, I don't know if it's like I don't know if it's a recognized record, but the most squibs ever used on one person. hilariously, he said that the last one went off and like hit him in the balls,
Yeah,
and
yeah.
he just had to sit there and because they wouldn't cut.
Yeah.
It that was worth the entire documentary right there.
Hit him in his left nut, he said.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
was
yeah. Right, exactly. That part's really funny, and they got to interview him for it, and he goes into the grueling nature of the whole experience. He says that like they filmed so many times, it was like 12-hour days. It's cold in that office, and he's just soaking in fake blood, so it just sounds miserable. But he was just such a great sport about it. But that's the funny thing. You mentioned how like In Search of Darkness is 4 hours long or almost 5 hours long, right? But that's a whole fucking decade. This is 4 hours of one movie, right? And I think that that's great because then you get all these little details. Like I know that there are diehard RoboCop fans, and there are people just kind of like in general where it's like I know a lot about RoboCop just because it's this movie that is from the '80s and everybody loves, right? Like I never knew that all the cops were named after serial killers. But then in retrospect, I'm like, okay. It's not as obvious as like Night of the Creeps, which we're going to talk about tomorrow with Anthony J.
yeah,
Rapino, where every single person is just named after a horror director, right?
yeah.
But that's a really super interesting detail that you learn just by watching a 4-hour documentary about a movie. You wouldn't know that. And like, I'm just trying to think, like we mentioned Texas before. You mentioned Texas because they filmed there. They were looking for a futuristic city. They didn't want to do like LA, and Dallas at the time had gone through this big rebuilding period, and so they used that like for external shots of Detroit. And I think it's really interesting. I kind of wanted to bring this up too, that they always wanted to do Detroit as the setting for RoboCop because they felt like it had the crime presence, but it also had that kind of industrial presence. And when you're
Mm-hmm.
watching this documentary, at least this first part, they go into detail about how so much of the design for like RoboCop himself and Ed 209 is based upon like cars, right? That like I think it's very interesting that like it's set in Detroit and like a big part of the design, the aesthetic is cars, right? They want like sleek cars for the designs for things. And I mean, they go into, I talked a minute ago about the suits. I talked about RoboCop's suit. And we kind of lightly talked about Ed 209, who just blew away that guy you were just talking about. And they go into great detail about how they made Ed 209 and things that go into creating it, like the animal noises they used, the recording from the producer, the machines they recorded that kind of make the noise of like his legs. They talked about like how like they're moving the puppet 24 times within 1 second of a shot
Oh,
to
the 24 frames a minute. Yeah.
24 frames. Yeah. So it's real interesting. And then they even made like this gigantic Ed 209 model to be there. And then in that squib scene that you're talking about, Paul Verhoeven is standing there pretending to shoot.
I've actually heard those stories about Verhoeven before, that
Yeah.
he would be on set like jumping around like a maniac in various places, like this documentary, episode 1 of 4, made me want to do 3 things. It made me want to rewatch the RoboCop trilogy, which I did in one day. It made me want to dig up the early work of Paul Verhoeven,
Yes.
especially this movie Flesh and Blood with Rutger Hauer that came out in, I believe, the mid '80s or early '80s. That I'm really interested in seeing, and not so much that something I want to do, but it gave me, like you just said, it gave me such an appreciation for sound designers, sound mixers, sound editors. Just with the Ed 209, like you have these industrial printing presses that do that are used to make the mechanical motion of his legs as he moves. Then, and it's so obvious it's so obvious when just rewatching RoboCop, when he lunges forward and you hear this giant robot making fucking animal noise, cat sounds. You're like, oh my God, how did I not notice that for the last 35 years? But you don't notice it until you watch this and you're like, oh my God. So the blending of all of these sounds and noises, it's like, it is amazing the work that these people behind the scenes do.
Yes.
Like there's just no amount of, there is an unlimited amount of respect that I have for the people that work behind the scenes on movies.
Yes, and they made it all for like $10 million, right? Like they weren't we were gonna make it for $12 million, and then the studio's like, no, we're gonna make it for like 10. And you know, they really make it work. And one last thing I want to mention, I guess two things. Paul Verhoeven, when they bring him on, it's just as exciting as when they bring on Peter Weller. You know, it's kind of like, oh, here comes the rock star. And I've always known about Paul Verhoeven. I mean, he's just always interviewed and stuff for things. He's always animated in his interviews. I mean, I remember like when we were growing up, like Showgirls was such a controversial thing. And so they would interview him. And then, of course, like I think Starship Troopers made like a really big splash. You know, it's kind of like, right. Go ahead.
That when I said I had heard the stories and I had seen video of Verhoeven acting as the monsters, that's what I was thinking of. It was Starship Troopers. I had just watched something with like Casper Van Dien and
Dina Meyer?
Dina Meyer and the
other one from Wild Things, right?
Yes.
What? Oh God, I gotta look her up now. Shit.
I know Dr. Christmas Jones from James Bond.
Yeah, so beautiful.
But I remember seeing a YouTube clip of them reacting to like the tennis ball that is going to be the bug, and Verhoeven is behind the tennis ball screaming and going like this, and I'm just like hysterical. Like, how do the actors keep a straight face when you have this like Dutch guy screaming?
Denise Richards, that's what it is.
Yes,
Denise
of course,
Richards.
Denise Richards. Yes.
So, you know, like Verhoeven's just always been around. I think that like Starship Troopers was kind of big right when like the internet and stuff was starting to really take shape and form. So I remember like really like learning a lot about Starship Troopers when it came out. And coincidentally, Ed Neumeyer and the other guy,
Michael
Miner worked on Starship Troopers as well, you know.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah, and then you mentioned Terminator a whole bunch of times, and one other thing they mentioned in this doc is how they considered Arnold for RoboCop at one point, but they're like, he's too big, you know, you can't put the suit on Arnold because he's already big to begin with.
That was another thing. I don't remember any of the names because my mind is just ridiculous. But
like Patrick Swayze was one of them.
They show the casting like papers with like all of the people that they had in mind for the roles of obviously RoboCop and then for Lewis. And I thought it was just a really interesting list of like to see these actors from like all of the It people from like 1982 to 85 are on that list. And Peter Weller wasn't on the list. He was like the last person really coming off of the strength of Buckaroo Banzai, which was really, even back then, kind of like a cult kind of hit, you know.
Weird ass movie.
Yeah. But I'm always interested in that. I always love seeing like, you know, like whether it's Back to the Future and seeing the scenes that they shot with Eric Stoltz, or, you know, Tom Selleck was going to be Indiana Jones, but he couldn't get out of Remington Steele. There was actually, that was another thing. There was an actress who they wanted to cast to play Lewis who couldn't get out of her Remington Steele contract. And I'm like, God, Remington Steele cost so many actors amazing roles. Like, it's like this friggin' like PI show in the 80s, and it's keeping people from doing amazing movies.
Yes, but I think for a good reason, you know, because the people we get in these movies are the people they're supposed to be. I
have to correct myself. It was Pierce Brosnan was going to be James Bond.
Oh, but then,
yes. So they had to go to Timothy Dalton.
Right.
And I was thinking of Tom Selleck. Yeah, Tom Selleck for Indiana Jones, but he couldn't because I think of Magnum PI.
Yeah.
which,
There's
or say, maybe I got the timeline, man. But I love those like alternate realities of who could have played who, and this
who could have been.
documentary,
Yeah.
yeah, this
This
episode shows you the casting sheets, and it's
yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah, like the sliding doors effect, right? Because they also
Hmm.
for like Lance Bodiger, right, the main villain, they showed who they would have cast for him, and I think Christopher Walken was on there, and also Lance Henriksen was one of the guys too.
So Lance Henriksen was
So that's
on
real
the
interesting too.
list.
But taking it back, go ahead.
Lance Henriksen was also on the
Go
list
ahead.
to play
Oh,
Murphy, which I think is funny that he was. So he was originally what James Cameron wanted for the Terminator. James Cameron wanted
right.
Lance Henriksen. He wanted the Terminator to just look like an average person. And the studio was
Right.
like, no, cast the monstrosity that was Arnold Schwarzenegger. And that was originally, they were against that. And then Lance Henriksen could have played the Terminator and RoboCop in a 3-year stretch. That would have been pretty
Jesus
freaking
Christ.
awesome.
Yeah. Just the people from that time, and Verhoeven, you mentioned before about how you want to go into his filmography and look at it some more. He made this one movie called Elle. Have you ever seen that movie? That's way after RoboCop. It
No.
was there's buzz about it. I would recommend checking that one out. It's nothing like RoboCop whatsoever. I think for Verhoeven, I've only seen RoboCop, Total Recall, Basic Instinct, Showgirls, Starship Troopers, and then this movie Elle. That's all I've seen of his work. But one thing that's really great about this documentary is it shows like his movies that he made in Holland, and they're before Robo just looks so like sleek and awesome, and they're from like the 80s. So it does make you watching this documentary makes you want to go check out those movies he made in Holland.
Yeah.
But I recommend for you, Danny, to check out this movie Elle, because it came out a couple of years ago and there's a lot of buzz about it. I thought it was really good. Sherry and I liked it a lot.
All right.
But I was going to say that go ahead.
No,
What were you
go
saying?
ahead. Nothing.
Oh, no. That there's one last thing I wanted to mention, though, is that Paul Verhoeven worked with this one cinematographer that he worked with in previous movies too. Right. And they show him like filming stuff in this movie, and it's amazing because that really captures the feel of this movie too. He says he makes a point how he wanted to make it like documentary style and very realistic, and he wanted to use the natural lighting that was in these rooms. And I think that that's so important for a movie like this, because like RoboCop obviously has like very futuristic sci-fi things in it, with these machines and stuff, but it's got this like real gritty aesthetic to it, which I think is another part of what makes this movie what it is.
No, and at the end of the day, like RoboCop it's a classic. It's shot wonderfully. The music in RoboCop by Basil Polidoris is one of my favorite scores ever. It's just like you totally understand why a talented group of documentary filmmakers wanted to spend over 4 hours covering every part of this movie. And I was looking at the credits, and I think they might get into some of the sequels, maybe. I don't know. I kind of hope they do now that I just watched them. I will say you might want to check out the sequels because you're a much bigger comic book fan than I, and parts 2 and 3 were co-written by a guy you might have heard of, Frank Miller.
Yes.
So all 3 RoboCop films for you and for our audience are streaming free on Prime. And this documentary, I mean, this is a reason, I said it earlier, I'll say it again. This is a reason to invest in SCREAMBOX. If you're a horror fan, if you're a genre fan, SCREAMBOX right now, I'm actually just finishing a movie that they just put up, another exclusive. They just put up Ty West's The Innkeepers, which is a movie I hadn't seen in years. I'm going to definitely rewatch that now that it's officially September. I broke out my Halloween shirt.
Yes.
I'm very excited. Their movie selection is really good, and they're getting a ton of cool exclusive things like this. again, you know, like I love Shutter, but the Shutter was up here, and SCREAMBOX has really narrowed that or leveled the playing field. And
Yes.
now they're both absolutely worth having and keeping around.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I totally agree. I really appreciated seeing this doc on there, and I want to go check out other docs by the people that made it. We still have 3 more hours of this to go through, so I'm looking forward to discussing it with you.
Definitely.
Tomorrow, Danny and I are going to record with Anthony J. Rapino, who has his own YouTube channel where he often does like unboxing videos of things he gets from flea markets, and like I think he's even done the Spirit Halloween stuff like you have, Danny, in the past. But
Mm-hmm.
besides that, Anthony is a horror book author and also wrote this nostalgia kind of He-Man inspired book. So we're taking a little nostalgic trip tomorrow to talk about Night of the Creeps, which there you go. He's got the DVD or the Blu-ray right there. He's waving it around. I have never seen Night of the Creeps. I just watched it for the first time for this video, and I'm super excited to talk about it. What else do you got
Weird
coming?
connection.
Oh, right.
Weird connection. The director of Night of the Creeps was Fred Decker, and Fred Decker directed RoboCop 3.
That's wow. Okay, that's awesome, man.
Yeah.
Holy shit! Night of the Creeps is his first movie, right?
It was either that or yeah. I think Night of the Creeps, then Monster Squad.
Oh my god, he did Monster Squad too.
Yeah.
Oh, holy shit! Okay, we got a lot to talk about tomorrow.
Ah.
Danny, what else is on the channel though that you want to plug real quick?
As far as we did an interview with Dane Elcar, who is the writer director of a new horror movie, sci-fi horror movie called Brightwood. That is out on the channel now. Dane was good enough to give us, you know, a nice amount of time. We talked all about the movie, the making of it, adapting the short film that I had seen years ago. So Brightwood is available on VOD now, and you can check out our interview with him. We also do a review of that movie on the channel. So if you have seen it and you want to, you know, watch a review of it, you can check that out. We talked a lot about the In Search of Darkness documentaries. David Weiner and the In Search of Darkness team have a new documentary that they are plugging called In Search of Darkness 1990 to 94. Today, as we record, is September 2nd. So you can still go on their website and read the synopsis of the upcoming documentary. The time has kind of expired to take the survey for it. That was yesterday, September 1st, but you could still read the synopsis for it, and you could check that out. I covered that in a video up on the channel. And as far as things I have in the pipeline, I am going to be doing a book review. Yes, me, a book review of Taking Shape 2, which is all about the Lost Halloween sequels.
Very cool.
And I'm going to be doing something that I've never done, which is sharing what my idea was for a Halloween sequel that I have buried in a notebook somewhere in my room that I have to find. And this book really just gave me inspiration to kind of try to get back into just writing another Halloween sequel. And yeah, we're always putting out new stuff. You know, we're going to be covering this every week. We have a few more interviews, like you said. We're going to have another. We're going to be doing Night of the Creeps tomorrow. We've had on our channel before Brian Asman, and I found his book, Man, Fuck This House. I bought it at Barnes and Noble the other day. Yeah. So
yeah,
that book, a read too.
That book was a big hit when it came out, and I definitely recommend it. It's a short, quick read, a lot of fun. He was great on the show too. If you guys are interested, you know, we did mention some horror writers so far. We have like a whole horror writers section on our channel where it's just us or me interviewing them, or Danny and me interviewing them. So definitely check it out. But yeah, Danny does put out stuff multiple times a week, and we make videos like this once a week. So if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. We got more RoboDoc coming up for you next week. And then we also have this week, Night of the Creeps. So we'll see you creeps real soon.